It's a brand new S24, so there's like 256 gigs of film in there. So Rhys, maybe like tell me your PhD in over sort of ecology, broadly ecology, and you did your PhD on what caused the Pleistocene die-off at the end of the Pleistocene.
Exactly. Yeah. Basically, what I was doing for my PhD in particular, as I started sort of like 3 projects, each analyzing the patterns of the megafauna extinction and how they can be explained. Like the first one I did, which is now out, was literally just what is it, climate or is it human activity that can generally explain the pattern of the extinctions? And generally, what we found is that you can predict it pretty well, just based on not only where humans evolved and spread from an early date, but also where their own ancestors kind of evolved. And then we're finding some other sort of patterns with traits and environmental features that can also affect timing and severity.
There is a way to look back at DNA and see population size, and
exactly
even the creatures that didn't go extinct shrank quite a bit.
Yes, I think you're thinking. I was a co-author on a project that looked at the populations over time of living megafauna and how all of them suffer a huge decline following roughly the arrival of humans, and that's the ones that survived, but even they were hugely impacted.
So there's no such thing as settled science, but the general scientific opinion is right now that humans played a oversized role.
I would hesitate to say general scientific opinion because I still get a lot of very angry people talking to me about this. But I think the science really supports that position better than any other position, and that was also the conclusion we came to in a review that we did very recently.
Yeah,
it was that like people have all these ideas that about. Well, you get the really weird theories, like it was a disease or it was a meteor, which is unfortunately tied up with all that crazy, like Graham Hancock, Atlantis is real, kind of bullshit, which of course means people take it seriously. Unfortunately, because the internet has no filters on this kind of stuff. But then you get the more, I think, scientifically serious debate between was this a result of climatic change, or was this a result of human activity? I think the data and the patterns as we have them overwhelmingly support human activity.
Maybe I'm personally invested in this, but I feel like when you have mammoths surviving on Wrangel Island till 3700,
which is also weird coincidence about the time human archaeological evidence first shows humans being on Wrangel Island.
Somehow the climate changed and all across.
There's some
Europe,
crazy
Asia,
climate change going on in Madagascar in 1200, right? And in New Zealand.
And the selectiveness of the extinction too, right? So there's no extinctions in the ocean.
It's so geologically and evolutionarily weird. It's like since the extinction of the dinosaurs, an extinction which also did not only affect large things, was affecting things across the board.
In the ocean.
Since for the entirety of the Cenozoic, so the period since the dinosaurs went extinct, mammals have been increasing in size on average, and although there have been extinctions, none of them specifically targeted large animals until the end of the Pleistocene, a period which was experiencing climate change very similar in a cycle that was very similar to what had already been going on
10 times, 15 times.
Basically we've had the same sort of cycle going on since the middle Pleistocene, so 200, 300,000 years, maybe more. 1 million years.
A long time.
The Pleistocene is 2.5 million years, 1 million, but we've been sort of in the same glacial interglacial cycle for about 1 million.
So at least 7 times and maybe 10 times, and they survived every single one of those.
And if you look at traits alone, megafauna should be better equipped to survive climate changes than smaller animals. They migrate farther. They can digest lower quality food. it doesn't really make sense.
A mastodon could eat spruce needles, and spruce needles were growing
Yeah,
from Florida
it's because spruce went extinct, right?
Yeah, and also I look at mastodon bone sites, and they're in California, Florida, Nova Scotia, Ontario, and the Yukon.
Yeah,
and there's not
everywhere.
a lot of them where the ice sheets were, because
Well, there wasn't a lot of anything.
whenever the ice melted, it blew out our fossil record.
Yeah.
So if the ice was there,
Yeah, there were
there's no-
probably, I wouldn't be surprised if there were mastodons in like Quebec or
there was
Ontario, you
in
know.
glacial-
I mean, we know there were some in southern Ontario where the glacial was
the glacial
less.
boundary.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same thing as Scandinavia. It gets wiped out every time.
Every time. So
So we
you
don't really know.
wipe your record clean, so you only have a few places to look at. You know, I'm a Canadian, so I'm obviously more interested in Canada. But if you look at the Canadian forest in the last millions of years, you know, you can't look at an Alberta lake bed and read the pollen. But if you looked in Beringia, how does that forest look before these animals disappeared? Can you tell us something about that?
Well, it's a little complicated because, you know, we're reconstructing this from pollen, and we actually, it's one thing I found difficult is that it's not actually very easy to look at the pollen records. I mean, like in terms of like what's been published for past interglacials. There's been stuff written about them, but it's hard to like get them in data set form,
Right.
which is something I'd really like to see done more, because there's been some really interesting stuff that was produced out of our lab in Aarhus by Elena Pierce, that showed that a lot of the way we reconstruct past ecosystems, including during interglacials, is impacted by the different rates that species produce pollen, the different ease with which you identify it, the likelihood of being deposited in a place where you're going to get a pollen core. Like it's always biased towards water.
Right.
Or so that has a huge impact.
And you were saying it's hard to see aspen, so it's difficult.
That's another one. Like aspen pollen is extremely fragile,
right.
So it doesn't preserve well.
Right.
So that's another big issue. But even that considered, there has been some stuff showing that while we don't entirely understand the way they were structured, interglacial environments past interglacial environments in places like the Yukon were different from the Holocene, having, you know, comparable amounts of spruce, but was it white spruce, black spruce? We don't really know, and again, we don't know. Well, I have looked into this. Spruce does create a lot of pollen.
It does,
comparably.
Yeah.
But some things that are notable is that pine is much less common, for example.
Yeah.
So we do know that they were fundamentally.
I read there's we went from less than 1% to 37%.
Yeah, something crazy, like in the Yukon.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, for some reason, lodgepole pine still doesn't really range into Alaska.
Yeah, it stops.
Yeah, but we also know that in the past it did.
Yeah.
In other interglacials, you did find lodgepole pine in like the Fairbanks area.
Yeah. Okay.
Possibly it was slightly warmer.
Yeah.
You know, like there are slight variations between interglacials. Like,
takes a bit longer, or they had a bit longer to move that way.
Maybe it was drier. You know. Yeah, maybe the fire cycle was different. Maybe herbivory pressures were different.
And lodgepole pine's interesting because it basically grows from the northern Yukon all the way down to northern California up high.
Yeah.
So it's quite a
Yes.
flexible species.
It's been speculated that it's one that's benefited from human impact as well.
Yeah.
Because it's very fire adapted.
Yeah,
and can grow on nutritionally very poor soils.
Yeah.
So which also feeds into the fire thing, because fire puts some nutrients back into the soil, but it's only very on the top and it's sucked right back up.
Yeah, it comes back up into the forest. There's no carbon stored in the soil.
Yeah.
So if we were to go back to this, the last interglacial in Canada, when was the last time we had forests in Canada like we do now? We'd probably be seeing a lot more animals than we would right
Absolutely.
now.
Like they'd be everywhere. We'd see megalonyx, so ground sloths, and not the really big ones, but the bear-sized ones.
Let's describe a ground sloth, just because.
Sure.
Simple terms.
Yeah. Picturing a tree sloth doesn't really put you on the right page.
Yeah.
But if you can picture a giant anteater.
Yeah.
With the face of a rhinoceros.
Okay.
You're about halfway there.
And Jeffersoness was like 1,000 pounds, or?
Yeah, somewhere in the 5 to 1,000 kilos range. So
Right.
it's cow-sized,
Cow-sized. Yeah.
or like a very large bear.
Yeah.
You know, but they seem to have been slightly smaller towards the far north.
Right.
So
And they were eating needles, or?
we don't really know.
Okay.
It's hard to say. We know what mastodons were eating because we have preserved feces.
Right.
So, and we have that for a few sloth species. A notable one is Shasta ground sloth, which existed in like the southwest of the U.S.
So there was caves or something they could find again?
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know if we have any of those for megalonyx.
Right. Okay.
But
megalonyx was in Canada.
yes.
Okay.
Jefferson's ground sloth is megalonyx.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Sorry, I have a tendency to speak in scientific
all
terms
good.
just because I mostly talk to to Europeans who don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
In terms of common names. But yes, so this was what we can do is look at isotopes, which kind of tells us, okay, was this? But that's also of limited use in northern places, right? Because generally isotopes are very useful if you're looking at extinct things in a tropical climate.
Yeah.
Because most of the grasses are C4 grasses,
Right.
meaning they.
Yes.
Yeah.
Different way of getting
I'm not a
energy
good enough
from the sun.
botanist to explain what C4 means, but it's
less sensitive to CO2.
exactly, yeah. It's a biochemical thing, but it makes it very easy to tell if species were eating mostly grass or mostly browse.
Yeah.
Whereas if you did it in a very northern climate, it would come up they were eating C3 vegetation.
Yes, which is 90.
Which is all of it. Yeah, it's like unless they're eating like a very specific tussock grass from like a mountain, like it's It's like no, they were eating So that's
probably eating both, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like it's. And we have an unfortunate tendency to characterize large animals as grazers or browsers when almost everything is both.
Right.
To some degree.
Yeah. Cows will eat brush.
Yeah, cows will eat brush. So will bison.
Yeah.
Moose will eat a little bit of grass, but definitely like rushes. And water plants and stuff like that. You know, it's like there are things that go more towards one way than the other, but it's a lot of both.
So the ground sloth, it's basically up to 2,000 pounds. It's like a cow. Now, how does it defend itself against predators? Like,
well, we don't think it could run very fast.
Yeah.
But if we look at another thing that can't really run very fast, and which is probably our best model for how these things were moving, like giant anteaters, we think they were probably just defending themselves, right?
Bipedal?
Yeah, they could rear up on their back legs.
Yeah.
In part because of defense, probably, but also because that's how they ate.
Yeah.
They would like pull
the tree
branches
down.
and they have these big claws that they could swipe, which is pretty good if your main antagonist doesn't have something it can throw.
And so let's talk about the antagonists on this landscape. We got North American lions.
Yes.
And they're quite similar to African lions.
Yes, probably.
Yeah.
Maybe a little larger. We're kind of unclear on whether they were social in the same way, but I tend to think they were, or at least close.
Yeah. We have smilodons.
Yes, not that far north generally, but in North America broadly.
And a smilodon is like, I want to say saber-toothed tiger, but
that's what you would call it. That's the colloquial, or saber-toothed cat.
Yeah.
But you also had another saber-toothed cat that ranged much further north, Homotherium, which we would call the scimitar cat.
Okay.
And scimitar cats were smaller than smilodons and more gracile, almost, but high up on the front. They looked like a hyena almost, and they were we think they were like pack hunting
bison,
cursorial, quite possibly bison, horse, even mammoth calves, not adults, but it was probably reindeer and caribou. I mean,
and in this environment, the wolf wasn't very mighty.
No, it's complicated. South of the ice sheets, you had dire wolves.
Yeah.
Which we now know not to be in the same genus as proper wolves.
Okay.
They were kind of their own thing.
Yeah.
Like an endemic
Not
North American. No, they weren't canis, but they were canids.
Okay.
So they were in an endemic lineage of wolf that evolved a very robust morphology.
Right.
Probably in response to a lot of competition and towards hunting very large things.
Yeah.
North of the ice sheets, you actually had gray wolves.
Yeah.
You had gray wolves south of the ice sheets as well, but
Yeah.
they seem to have been more like we would now call red wolves,
Like coyotes.
or coyotes. Yeah.
The wolves were the coyotes.
They had a more generalist kind of,
Yeah.
not quite jackal thing.
Opportunists.
Yeah, exactly. But north of the ice sheets, you had no dire wolves, but you had gray wolves. of a type that we would call cave wolf or robust wolf.
Yeah.
They were about the same size, roughly, as
Yeah.
a wolf that you would get up north today.
Mm-hmm.
But their faces were like solid and short.
Okay.
And their bite strength would have been much higher.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at their isotopic ecology, which works better for predators up north generally, they were eating almost like 60% or more horse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so they love the horse.
Yeah, they were
And the horse originated in South America?
North America.
North America, okay. And then it went over to Asia.
Yeah, it colonized South America and Eurasia from North America.
Okay. And did that the great South American North American interchange when it went
Roughly, yeah.
Okay. But it basically originates in North America. It's in North America for 25 million years or 30 million years?
Yeah, I'd say equids in general have been present in North America since they evolved.
Yeah.
Which was sometime not that long after the extinction of the dinosaurs.
Right.
But they started like little things.
Yeah.
Things, and then over time you get things that progressively look more and more like a
Mhm.
horse. Probably the modern species that is still alive is the domestic horse, which did also evolve in North America.
Yeah.
Was around by the early Pleistocene,
Mhm.
sometime in the past 3 billion years.
Yeah.
But it evolved from things that would have looked very similar, just like
For sure.
just like zebras and donkeys and things like that.
And they are related to zebras, are they not?
Yeah. A donkey is closer to a zebra than to a horse, but they're all in the same genus.
Right.
And basically, zebras and donkeys are just the descendants of members of the same genus that went to Eurasia earlier.
Yeah.
But then you have the modern horse species evolve in North America and spread everywhere.
Yeah.
Become very successful.
And then go extinct in North America and then be
Yes.
reintroduced.
Surprisingly
So-
recent.
Yeah.
We keep finding out.
Okay.
Is latest. I mean, they have some weird archaeological estimates that say like 1,200 years ago, but those are often based on like sort of indirect
Mhm.
kind of evidence.
Yeah.
Like we dated the ash from a fire nearby.
Yeah.
But if you look at, there's some interesting stuff going on in Arctic habitats right now with environmental DNA.
Yeah.
And sedimentary DNA.
It's sitting in the permafrost.
Yeah, basically you can
Yeah.
see when the signal from that species
Disappears.
stops. Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, because the fossil record of a species is kind of dependent on a species being common.
Yeah.
Right? Like, because fossilization is inherently rare.
Yeah.
So when that cuts off, it doesn't necessarily mean the species went extinct. It
Yeah.
just means it stopped being common,
Yes.
which you would expect if, a
Yeah.
super predator like humans showed up.
Mm-hmm.
But there remains the possibility for relictual populations and a very long extinction process.
Yeah.
Environmental DNA for horses and mammoths currently places them in and around Dawson City, Yukon, at
5,000 years ago?
as late as 3,800.
3,800 years ago.
Yeah.
So, and that's not a very well told story at this
No,
point. Everyone
It's kind of a
says
news
they're gone.
story. It's
Yeah.
part of it.
Residual populations eking out a living far from where there's
Exactly.
a lot of people.
Like, yes, the Arctic was settled first, but it was always going to have the lowest density of people.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So and a lot of space. So there's always opportunities for
Mhm.
relics.
Yeah.
But then eventually they obviously did disappear.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's weirdly late. Like there's evidence for elk wapiti
Yeah.
in Yukon, again around Dawson City,
Yeah.
until around 3,000 years ago.
Okay.
The record near interior Alaska, Fairbanks, goes to 500 years ago.
Okay. Yeah.
But they weren't there when Europeans showed up.
Yeah.
And the same thing for bison.
Yeah.
People say it's wood bison, but I'm kind of skeptical.
So let's just hit that. You got bison priscus and you got bison Athabasca in Yukon right now.
Yeah.
But we're calling the bison we're finding there bison priscus had wider
Yeah,
horns and
it's kind of there's a lot of over description with bison. It's like as soon as a bison's a little bit different, we give it its own name.
yeah.
But really, it's like this was a large population that spanned the entire Earth.
Yeah.
Or northern hemisphere.
Yeah.
Or that was very variable depending on
Yeah.
location and what it was eating.
So is bison vanassus is the European bison? So there's not much difference between bison vanassus, bison and bison antiquus is kind of what you're saying.
No, and then European and American bison are still fully interfertile, which
Yeah.
is more than we can say of.
I have a stupid question as a layman. When I was in university, we learned biology. A species was a species if it could have fertile offspring.
Yeah, that's what we call the biological species concept.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Uh-huh.
The problem is taxonomic terms don't have like the firmest grip in reality,
Mhm.
right? They're a tool for convenience that we use to describe things in a way that's consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Some
Would it be more honest to say subspecies?
yeah, like I which is an even worse defined thing. But,
Yeah.
I know what you're getting at. But like it's some people would argue that European and American bison maybe aren't good proper species.
Yeah.
And that's maybe valid.
Yeah.
But it's hard to say it's one or the other because there's more than one definition that people are using for species.
I struggle in the Yukon because I read about bison bonassus and bison and priscus, right? And so well, the bison athabascae or wood bison, they're not natural here. And I'm like, but it's kind of the same species. And do you feel like people are putting too much emphasis on
I'm
natural?
on two sides of this because on one hand, I do believe that the native type of bison that survived in Alaska, Yukon until very recently,
The priscus.
Yeah. Or possibly occidentalis,
Okay.
which is kind of a dwarf priscus.
Okay.
Was different from wood bison, and there is genetic evidence to support that. Generally, even right up until the late Holocene, bison from Alaska, Yukon group with a second immigration of bison from Eurasia that happened later. Whereas all North American bison living today, including wood bison from before when plains bison were integrated into that herd, group with the subglacial population, the one that survived in the south. That doesn't mean it's impossible that there was hybridization or anything, or that like
because there's a line through
there's some there is evidence for some hybridization, though it's almost all Alaska, Yukon towards the south, not the other way around. So it's not impossible that wood bison have some phenotypic influence from northwestern bison. On the other hand, and I don't think it matters.
Okay, that's my. I guess that's.
I get it. That's the crux of your question: is whether or not it's important biologically.
If I'm out west of Whitehorse and there's a herd of wild horses, they're not invasive in my mind because horses originated in North America.
And I would argue that the genetics supports them being the same species, as well as what we would call Equus caballus lambi.
We're getting lost in this trying to restore some magic perfect thing that didn't ever really exist because biology's always
and Puritanism is everywhere.
Yeah, we need to rewild the earth without getting too caught up in
and people care about these things far more than nature does, right? It's like two bison don't know the difference.
We just need to get the nutrient cycling up. So back to the villains in our cast. So we just got a little off on a little sidetrack there. So we got this dire-wolf, we got North American lions, very similar to African lions, bigger.
Scimitar cats.
Is the grizzly bear in this system?
In Beringia, yes. There's some evidence that grizzly bears didn't colonize south of the ice sheets until the Holocene.
And was that because they had a bigger, uglier cousin?
Unclear. It might just be that they didn't get there.
Was there short-faced bear?
There is evidence of competition. Yeah, short-faced bear was present both north and south of the ice sheet. Arctotus simus, but there is some evidence of competition where it's funny. It goes both ways because in Europe and Central Eurasia you had cave bears. Cave bears were more herbivorous than brown bears. But short-faced bears were more carnivorous. Yes, and in both cases we see that where they're in the same place as cave bears, brown bears become more carnivorous, and where they're in the same place as short-faced bears, they become more herbivorous to compensate and avoid competition. So they
exploiting niches that have less exploitation.
And it's very possible that much like gray wolves have possibly taken over a lot of the role of dire wolves, and after their extinction, brown bears have taken on a lot of the role of short-faced bears in a very general kind of way. And there's a few examples like that. Like moose seem to have replaced stag moose. Elk were not in North America at all until the last glacial, about 20,000, 15,000 years ago.
So they came in with humans,
they're just new. But I don't think that's anything to do with extinctions. I think that's just
when I look at a red deer and I see an elk. The elk's more vocal, but there's a lot of phenotypic similarities there.
And they are similar. And it's also worth noting that elk aren't exclusively found in North America. You find the same species in East Asia. And that's more closely related to the North American ones than it is to to European ones.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with moose.
Yeah.
European moose are more distant from, East Asian moose are and Siberian moose are more distant from European moose than they are from North American moose.
So a Kamchatka moose is more like an Alaska
Yeah.
moose than it is like a Swedish moose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, you could argue that there essentially are no moose subspecies in North America. It's all just one very recent, phenotypically plastic thing. You certainly genetics would support
It's
that.
handy to help the outfitters sell a.
Exactly. But it seems to be very situational. Like if you introduced moose from like northern Ontario into Alaska or Yukon, it's not impossible that they would just take on Alaska moose-like characteristics because it's a symptom of like.
I was reading there were some horses that had gone up into northern Siberia that were kind of introduced.
Kushan ponies.
Within 200 years, they had developed genetics that significantly improved their survival in the north.
And this is something that affects our definition of species all the time. Is that species are very flexible.
Yeah.
And they change.
Yeah.
All the time. It's like people actually thought for a long time that those Siberian ponies had influence from the native Siberian wild horse, very similar to what would have had in Alaska, Yukon.
Yeah.
But which we knew even before some of the evidence from Yukon survived in Siberia until like 3,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And possibly because there were more grasslands. But for a long time, people thought they had influenced the genetics of this native pony type, but they didn't.
Okay.
It's completely unrelated. It's just horses were brought up there and developed very similar characteristics.
So probably bison Athabasca, which are, been in the Yukon now for about 40 years, 45 years.
Yeah.
They're going to develop specific sets of genes to help them in that different environment.
Sure. I mean,
we're probably already seeing it.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem with why people thought wood bison, and still think wood bison were native to Alaska, Yukon, is that skeletons of what were called bison occidentalis or bison occidentalis look very similar to wood bison skeletons.
Yep.
And it's possible that's due to hybridization, it's possible that's due to similar selective pressures, but there was also a huge problem for a long time with people identifying bison fossils south of the glacial sheets as bison occidentalis. And it kind of just turns out that bison are very variable. Yeah. And it's kind of hard to tell. Yeah. Generally, it's now accepted that occidentalis should be confined to Alaska, Yukon. Okay. There's still a lot of confusion.
It's all bison to me, man.
Me too. It's my job to know the names and the patterns, but I agree. It's
if we were to go back in time to we could go back to the last interglacial in Canada, which is about 140,000 years ago.
130 to 115.
Yeah. So let's go back to that time, and we're going to get in a helicopter and fly around 10 square kilometers of land. What do you think we're going to see in that 10 square kilometers?
I think it depends what part of Canada.
Let's
say west.
Let's say west, and let's say we're kind of on the boundary between the Mammoth Steppe and the Boreal Forest.
All right. Well, we're going to see ground sloths.
In 10 square kilometers, how many do you think we'd see?
Oh, I have no idea. A lot. Probably comparable to. Oh, in 10? Maybe more than that.
Yeah.
But it's also a question of whether or not you'd see them too, because they'd be up against the tree.
Sure. Let's pretend we can see them all.
That's okay. I have no idea how many.
More than one.
Yeah, more than one.
How many bison do you think we'd see in 10 square kilometers?
At least 20, I would think.
So let's say we have 20, and then what else are we going to see in that area?
Horses.
How many horses?
A lot.
Yeah.
More than bison.
So like 30 maybe?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. It's kind of hard to tell.
We don't have to be exact.
No, but it's kind of hard to tell. I know what they would be for like pure steppe.
Yeah.
Right, but that's maybe going to be a little higher for some of these species and a little lower for others.
Yeah.
So it's a lot is fair. Maybe it's easier to put it in terms of weight.
Yeah.
For a low productivity system in Africa, one that doesn't have particularly good soil, a lot of water, you would still get easily 5,000 to 10,000 kilograms of herbivore per square kilometer. And you can divvy that up however you want.
Yeah.
And keep in mind that about a third of that's going to be an elephant. But even without that, you got about
so 10 tons per square kilometer. So in our 10 square kilometers here, we would have 100 tons of herbivores.
Yeah.
And about 30% 70% of it's gonna be elephants. If we're on the boundary, we'll probably have more mammoths than mastodons, but we'll probably
Sure, and
have
like you
both.
also have like a continuum of woolly mammoth to Columbian mammoth.
Okay,
Because
tell me about that.
okay, so woolly mammoths would have been the norm for boreal and Arctic habitats,
Yeah.
right? But south of that, you had Columbian mammoths, which same genus, different species, but fully interfertile, and you get transitional forms in between in
Right.
like Manitoba, Alberta, that kind of
Okay,
southern British Columbia.
and they both ate trees somewhat.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. The mammoths seem to have had slightly more adaptations towards grazing than some
Yeah.
living elephants, but they would still be classified as mixed feeders,
Yeah.
eating a lot of deciduous and some coniferous browse.
Right.
So you would have had a continuum of mammoths of different types going from Alaska all the way down to Costa Rica.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just everywhere.
Everywhere.
And and then they would be replaced by gomphotheres in
Yeah.
Central and
That's
South
good.
America,
Yeah.
and then mastodons would have a similar range to the mammoths,
Right.
although they weren't found on the steppe during glacial periods.
We'd find the mastodons in the spruce forest and the pine
spruce forest, and also in a lot of like mixed kind of
Yeah.
habitats, which would have been very common.
And they could eat cedar, they could eat larch, they could eat
Yeah,
pine.
and they seem to have been eating a lot of deciduous stuff and
Yeah.
even some grass as well, and a lot of forbs like
Yeah,
mugwort,
fireweed and
mugwort,
yeah. Okay.
that kind of stuff, or wormwood it might also be called.
Right.
Artemisia.
Yeah.
Which was everywhere.
Yeah.
Because another thing that we don't talk about also is that it wouldn't just be grasslands,
Yeah.
right? Because herbivores eat all the grass.
Yeah.
It would have been forbs and herbs forever.
So let's talk about, we have 100 tons of herbivores on my fictitious 10 square
Yes.
kilometer plot. How many pounds of manure we'll use pounds?
Enormous amounts.
Enormous amounts.
I don't have good enough an idea about how much an individual animal produces to
I
give you a
think an
figure.
elephant's like 300 pounds a day on average.
Yeah, a lot.
So if we had on 10 square kilometers, if we had 10 elephants, is that a fair number?
Yeah. Roughly.
So we'd have 300 times 10.
Might maybe more if there's niche separation, but like if you have a lot of mammoths and a lot of mastodons,
Yeah.
maybe it's 1.5 times that or something like
Either
that.
way, we've got
A lot.
tons of manure going into this landscape every
Probably
year.
tons of dung beetles everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. And the carbon in the soil would have been significantly higher.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the soil would have had higher nitrogen levels. Well, it's been less acidic.
Yeah.
More compact.
Yeah.
Drier.
Yeah.
Because these are all effects that herbivores have on soil,
Right.
and which has meaningful impacts on floral communities.
Yeah.
And it would have been everywhere.
Yeah.
There's some allowances to that, right? Like areas that are naturally very wet.
Yep.
Or which might also have been less common.
Mhm.
But also, like if you look purely at climate factors for boreal forest or
Yep.
tundra, these are arid ecosystems.
Yeah, like
They do not have high
yeah,
precipitation.
30 centimeters of
yeah, if-
precipitation in here kind of thing.
I was looking at a thing earlier, like if you somebody was calculating the climate space in which the mammoth steppe existed.
Mhm.
The periphery of that is like the same climate as like Whitehorse
Yeah.
or something like that
Yeah.
today. It's like there was, it's not a wet area.
No,
I don't-
it's a dry area.
Yeah, and
and
also-
so it's really important to manage your moisture.
Yeah.
Because you don't get a lot of moisture. So this dung in the soil is really going to help get every last drop of water stored and back into plant
Yes,
growth. Versus,
But it's almost all going to be going into plant growth. In fact, there's probably going to be even more water taken out of the air.
right.
And,
So it's
and-
dry.
Yeah, and going right into the roots of grasses and
Right.
herbs and trees.
Safely storing carbon.
Exactly, and it just gets piled on top of each other and piled on top of
Yeah.
each other, and everywhere you have ground squirrels,
Mhm.
you have pikas,
Yeah.
steppe pikas, which are
Yeah.
a little different from
Yeah.
mountain pikas, and you have
Marmots.
marmots and voles everywhere
Yeah.
just digging, and then all of it just gets pulled down and eaten by all this mycobacteria
Yeah.
and
It wouldn't have been a very great place to be a fungus. You would have had less fungal reliance on sort of fungal.
Yeah, it
members.
depends.
Well, I guess it'd be a different.
it would have been a
fungus.
very patchy kind
Yeah.
of place, right? And it would just so many areas in different levels of succession.
Mhm.
And you probably still would have had like dense spruce forests
In
in
a few
some places,
for sure.
as a result of like maybe there was a big die-off of, or maybe this is an area of rough topography where
Yeah.
herbivores don't have great access.
Yeah.
It's like the point is that there would be so much more variety
Than
and
we
so
have
much more
today.
disturbance.
So today we have like 200,000 hectare fires in
Yeah.
northern Canada that create basically the same age stand of one or two species.
Exactly.
But in the past, we never had big areas.
No, there would because there would have been fire breaks everywhere.
Yeah. Let's talk about fire. What's the fire interval on this system?
It depends on which plant is locally dominant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to affect the system going forward as well, right? Like there was a paper that showed. We talked about this a bit earlier, but I'll read it for the camera. There was a paper that showed in Siberia that the reason why larch forests are the norm there, deciduous larch forests, whereas spruce forests are the norm in similar climates in North America, is almost entirely to do with which one got a foothold earlier,
right?
After the end of the Pleistocene.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is once larch gets established, it sets up its own fire cycle.
Yeah.
Because larches are further spaced apart and generally have more diverse understories, which encourages grasses and herbs, which also have their own fire cycle, which is very short. And larches don't generally top kill, at least when in their own forests, because they drop dead lower branches and they have very thick resistant bark towards the lower half of their.
So there's nothing to burn in the crown, and the ground fire is
essentially
resilient.
forming a large savanna.
Right. Gotcha.
Just like there's aspen savanna in some places. Very
Aspen parkland.
Yeah, aspen parkland. Aspen parkland is possibly a great example of what a lot of these ecosystems might look like.
Might have looked like,
especially with really high herbivore density.
East slope, Rocky Mountains, lots of elk and deer and
lots of bison. And horses and numerous other things. Beaver everywhere.
Yeah, and giant beaver.
Oh yeah, Castorides. Which interesting because they were almost like a giant nutria or koibu or whatever we call it now.
Not like a beaver.
No, they didn't build dams. We don't think. We don't even think they ate bark. We think they ate water plants.
Okay.
Almost like a rodent manatee.
Okay.
They're just going through the rivers eating like
all
water plants.
Water plants.
Yeah.
It must have hibernated then. Hey?
Oh well, maybe they ate something else in the winter. I don't really know. But it's just the general. They weren't beaver-like ecologically. Really.
Yeah.
They were kind of doing their own thing.
Right.
But yeah, you would have had many weird things. What's another good northern one? Like horses, bison, elk everywhere, caribou everywhere.
Caribou is pretty much the same as today. Like it's.
Yeah, but again, you would have had the two types, right? You would have had the more open country, wildebeesty ones, and then you would have had the more the ones eating lichen in closed forests, which were maybe less common or ecologically acting different.
Right.
You know, like because it's.
I wonder about we'll call them the mountain caribou, but the woodland caribou.
Yeah.
I've been doing some sort of watching them, and where I've been finding, I'm trying to pattern where they are, and what I've been finding is if there's a burn, and there's a very hot burn, so you have like maybe a 40-year-old stand of lodgepole pine, and there's a boundary on an older stand, so the fire went out there, but the fire didn't go out exactly there because it creeped a bit forward, so it left sort of a semi-open, something more perhaps similar to what existed in the past, and they're just living in these little fringes between the dense old forest and the dense young forest where the fires kind of stopped. I wonder if that's like Sweden has a lot of reindeer, which are reindeer tremendous. It's the same
species.
Same species. If I don't want to get too specific, and we have we're in Sweden right now. We have 275,000 reindeer in Sweden, and in Sweden we have a lot more semi-open forests, which means more rain is getting to the forest floor, which means that the lichen grows better.
Sure, I mean, like we think of reindeer, caribou, whatever you want to call them, as some sort of lichen specialist, but that's not actually true. No, they can eat a lot more lichen than other things, but they eat huge amounts of grass and herbs as well. In fact,
mountain birch.
Exactly, and willows, and they're a mixed feeding, mid-sized herbivore, which affects what they eat, and they would have filled probably a very similar niche to one that we now associate with like wildebeest or something.
Right.
Like mid-sized, is moving in big herds. Different predator effects depending. Just like in the north we would have had Sega antelope as well.
Right. And how big were the Sega antelope? They weren't huge. Eh?
Yeah, no, it's like if you imagine a goat that's about the right size. They would have been the smallest ungulate in the far north. And they were probably eating they were probably very reliant on big herbivores to remove a lot of the tougher grasses and stuff.
Right.
Because they, just like, say, Thompson's gazelle is today, because they would have been eating a lot of forbs and herbs. And
Very dry, low protein.
exactly, like the high quality in terms of digestibility.
Right.
In a lot of legumes and stuff like that. Like they would have been eating the good stuff because they had small stomachs that can't really handle the tough stuff.
Right.
So they were kind of dependent on having this sort of because we do have evidence of a sort of a grazing succession.
Yeah.
In a lot of these habitats.
The elephant can do anything because it has a bigger stomach.
Yeah. But then you also get bison coming in, and horses, which can eat very low quality grasses.
Yep. Yep.
It is, and then elk and caribou and sega.
Each thing was taking something that someone else could use, turning it into manure, which was making everything grow even better.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it was a virtuous cycle. So if you had to use a number, if we're today in Canada, how many more pounds of meat per hectare do we have? In this?
Than we have now?
Yeah, 100.
I mean, you could probably just say whatever number I thought would be natural and subtract 0 from it because
it's close to 0.
Well, yeah. I mean, like if you spread it out, if you consider how spread out it is.
Yeah.
I mean.
I see a sparse landscape. I feel a longing for the Garden of Eden or something. Sure. I feel like something's missing on the landscape.
Think about the bison densities that we have in Canada right now, even post reintroduction.
Yeah.
Something like half a bison per square air kilometer.
Yeah.
At best.
In
areas close to the reintroduction.
Yeah.
It's.
So they're missing their friends to get those other things. That
10%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or. Yeah.
5%, yeah. And that's just where you have bison, because when you don't have bison in the system, the moose aren't very heavy, the reindeer caribou don't weigh much, so it's...
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
And all of it would have been higher with the addition of mammoth as well.
Yeah.
Oh, it's and we also heavily suppress densities in a lot of places too, through hunting, and, or just through management.
Yeah.
And because it's not just that, yes, these animals are a natural resource, but we also have sort of this very archaic idea about what natural densities look like.
Oh, we can't have too many, we're exceeding the carrying capacity.
Yeah, no, we're not. Yeah. Do you have an idea how many, so Wrangel Island, we talked about earlier, that used to have mammoths, but hasn't for about 3,000 years.
Yeah.
It also didn't have reindeer or muskox.
Okay. Just mammoths.
It did have reindeer and muskox at some point, but by the time they were, those things also went extinct on Wrangel. Both have been since reintroduced. But every concept they had of carrying capacity for those things was immediatly thrown out the window.
Yes.
Because the feedback system, they were actively improving the habitat. Until it was the carrying capacity kept getting higher.
Yeah.
And to the point where they now actively remove a lot of it.
And you're talking about moose too, they put a moose into a system, and the more moose you have, the more moose you can have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's because it actively improves the system for...
I'm going to back up on a philosophical question. So, we tend to have this, and I'm from Vancouver, so not everybody understands this reference, but we have Stanley Parkitis. The people live in big cities, and they tend to walk around in big cities, and they're quite concerned about disruption to nature. But I feel like as humans, you think we have a capacity to maybe bring back a percentage of these systems to, even if we could get to 10% of it, we could do so much good. If we could, reintroductions, don't get too caught up on, it used to look exactly like this, because nothing ever looked exactly like this.
I think a lot of people, when I talk about sort of rewilding, get this idea that I want things I want museum ecosystems, or what it says they're called. I'm trying to recreate things exactly to the picture of what I think they look like. Yeah. But that's not the point. The point is, I recognize that there has been this huge loss of what was a fundamental trophic component in the world over, and that has consequences to how ecosystem functioning happens now.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly concerned with the restoration of those things being identical to how they were.
And they never really achieve a steady state. I'm not an ecologist, but my understanding is, you kind of find harmony for a bit, and then one thing changes, and then it'll move.
Sure, everything is always changing.
Yeah.
There was no.
But what's changed the most is that there's way less animals out there.
Yes, right? And that's not just megafauna either. It's just
Well, the
Yes.
megafauna carried the burden of the nutrient cycling. Like a spruce needle that falls off a tree today in
Yeah.
Canada might be on the ground for 20 years.
Yeah, like I think we have to remember is that the amount of time between the majority of the megafauna extinctions and today is geologically and evolutionarily a blip.
Mhm.
It's nothing.
Nothing.
It just happened.
How long did it take? Is my understanding, you have the 65 million years ago, you have the Klipspid crater. Is it the KT?
The Chicxulub.
Chicxulub?
I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's something like that.
So you have, this big,
Meteor.
15 kilometer wide rock moving at 30,000 kilometers an hour, hits the earth, wipes out pretty much all the non-avian dinosaurs. The dinosaurs live on today, but they
As
have
birds, yeah.
chickens. How long did it, so there wasn't anything with eating trees for a while, because
No. In fact, it looks like the world was a forest.
After that.
A very hot forest
Mhm.
for a while.
Mhm.
And you had some large animals, but it was weird.
Mhm.
Like in the early stages, so the Paleocene and the early Eocene.
Yep.
The largest animals were reptiles.
Yep.
That had sort of evolved very quickly,
Mhm.
and which were very suitable to the very hot conditions.
Yep.
And you had, in some cases, a lot of very large birds.
Yep.
Like Gastornis
Okay.
and that kind of
And
thing. Which
by
were
very
herbivorous.
large, like,
Yeah, I mean, like not that big. Like
Mhm.
as big as the largest flightless birds that we know today, like moas or
right,
or
so we're not talking tons, we're talking
No, we're not.
100 kilograms or something.
Yeah, and they were eventually replaced as the world got a little cooler towards the end of the Eocene and when mammals started to catch up,
Mm-hmm.
which is when you first see these very large, like late Eocene, early Oligocene, rhinoceros kind of things.
Yep.
Even
And so, like,
brontotheres and
20 million years after?
yeah,
15 million years after?
yeah, somewhere in that range. Like
So if we don't fix our lack of tree predators,
no, it's like it's
we're going to be waiting
it's,
a while.
Basically, it has been the norm to have large mammals on the scene
Mhm.
since there have been large mammals.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Yeah.
and also, like, basically the dinosaurs had, I think about
Sure.
a long neck,
Sauropods.
so something, it's eating trees.
Yeah.
Because that's the only
And-
thing that will feed anything like that.
And that's the only thing there was.
Yeah.
Hey, another thing we forget is that grass didn't become common until
Really?
like the Miocene.
Okay,
Which-
and the Miocene, how long ago?
But it's one of the really weirdly big ones.
Mhm.
It's more than 5 million years, maybe less than 30.
Okay, so basically we had trees, we had things eating trees,
Yeah.
dinosaurs.
In fact, a lot of the plants that we have now that are doing really well in the absence of herbivory are weirdly the older ones. Like
Yeah.
conifers were everywhere during the dinosaur age.
Yeah.
And yeah, they were being eaten, but like by these extremely large
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. And they wouldn't really even have a predator, right? So if we go back to this Canadian interglacial, if I'm a mammoth, I'm not too concerned about anything.
No,
My baby might get eaten once in a blue moon.
and even that probably isn't having a huge effect on your population.
Yeah.
Another thing that is sort of affecting our management decisions now is that people have this idea that predation is supposed to control all herbivores,
Right.
which is not true.
Yep.
Even if you look at an African system with lions and
Mhm.
hyenas,
Mm-hmm.
what predation does is it shifts herbivore composition
Yep.
in favor of the largest
Yep.
stuff.
Yep.
But that's often a good thing because larger species are more general,
Yep.
generally have impacts that are more widespread,
Mhm.
and are less likely to have really strong impacts on really specific species.
Right.
Another thing that predation does is it often causes species to avoid certain areas
Yep.
and creating a more mosaic thing. But even that also limited to usually to species on the smaller end.
So like that, maybe I've heard of that as the culture of fear that
Yeah,
lions
landscape
create.
of fear.
Yeah.
So and that can be inconsistent. Like when they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone.
Yep.
There was some evidence for that with elk,
Mm.
and certainly evidence that
There was a paper that just came out that showed they didn't make any difference.
yeah, it's controversial,
Uh-huh.
but certainly it seemed like I think the evidence was pretty good that wolves had a population effect on elk. Like there's certainly a stronger effect on elk than on say bison, to which they had basically no effect. And
Yeah.
bison
But
have-
it's like, we don't care.
And in fact, we're actually really glad that the elk are less populous now, and we're going to expand.
At the expense of the elk because of the
Yes,
wolves.
but we're more generalists, so maybe we're having actually less of a specific impact on like riverside vegetation and stuff like
right,
that.
right.
So
As a beaver, it's all you get, right?
exactly,
So,
but
if you get too far from the river, you're gonna get eaten. So.
yeah, but I think generally we have this idea as people that we need to manage all herbivores to below a certain thing for ecological reasons.
The carrying capacity doesn't make any sense to me because you have this it's almost like a 19th century idea that you can only have this many animals in there, but if you have different animals, they eat different things, and you can just build and build and build and build, right? Because each niche it's like a industrial park. You know, the factory has a throwaway component, and another factory sets up beside it. That's not waste. That's my whatever. And we would like in British Columbia we have sawdust, which was waste. They burnt it in beehive burners, and all of a sudden it was energy, right? So without the sawmill, you don't have the energy plant. Each thing you adds to the system. It becomes like more. So I feel like we're operating at a fraction of what we used to, right?
Yeah. And like that, and I mean, people will hear me talk about this and think I'm like anti-hunting or anti-meat or something like that, which is not true.
Yeah.
It just means I think the way we think about populations of these things is very different than maybe the way we should.
Yeah.
You know, and like
yeah. But the argument I would say, like, so we're in Sweden, there's no predators. So
sure, I mean, like you get the occasional wolf in some places, but
it's a big deal. They're like, hey, did you see the wolf go by the farm? Yeah,
exactly.
So last night I went out. There's some wild swine that were digging up a field. So the guys trying to get rid of them. And we had the night camera, and I saw 7 roe deer, and we saw some wild swine. And it was successful, but. There was hares, probably 8 hares last night, and we went on a very short walk. We might have looked at maybe 20 hectares. And yesterday I was walking around the Swedish countryside, and there was wild swine droppings everywhere. They've been digging under the anthills. It seems like it's a pretty live system here, despite the fact that there is no natural predators, but the human predator effect is very significant.
Yes.
There's a lot of hunting, but there's also a lot of animals. Whereas I'm in the Yukon, there's almost no human hunting pressure in the Yukon as compared to Sweden. You have 500,000 hunters in Sweden and maybe 2,000 in the Yukon, same size of landscape. But I just don't see the animals in the Yukon, despite the fact that it's a wild, perfect, natural, and it's not that different of we're at the same latitude. It's not that different of a system. We have spruce and pine.
In many ways, it's very similar.
Yeah.
And I would say probably a lot of the difference is food availability.
Yeah.
And that kind of comes down to like the level of disturbance in the system.
All I see is spruce trees.
And also the number of people in the system too,
yeah.
Right? Like something that's really been behind the wild boar explosion is that they can exploit agricultural food.
Yeah.
Which is also very true of roe deer and rabbits. Like, we're removing all of this coniferous forest and planting all these gardens and farms, and they love it.
But at some level, like the Swedish countryside is maybe like a little bit like this sort of interglacial Canadian forest because there's gaps, there's openings.
Sure. I mean, and that kind of comes down to something I was saying earlier. I forget if we were filming it about how there's been this conversation in Europe about disturbed ecosystems.
Yep.
For so much longer. Well, honestly, that isn't even happening in Canada.
Yeah.
Like in the 90s, we had this guy, Frans Vera, who came out, who was a Dutch guy, and who came out and said, isn't it weird that most of the species that live here are adapted not to forest conditions, but to open, like, rangelands and agricultural systems or open steppes, and we just see way more birds and insects in these places.
In the farms.
Yeah, and it's like, well, why is that? Is it that they've evolved to be on farms? No. It's that they evolved to live in open, changing, mixed habitats, which used to be the norm.
And now it's these dense coniferous forests.
And there's been some discussion about what drives that, but like his theory at the time, which I largely agree with, though I think it's more relevant for the Pleistocene than the Holocene, was that this was due to herbivory.
Yeah.
And that you would have had large numbers of animals on the system, creating a lot of disturbance.
Yeah.
happens in Europe.
Spruce trees didn't just get to grow.
No,
They lived in a landscape.
there was more
of fear.
happening. There was not only was there more herbivory, but the fire cycle was also different.
Yeah.
And possibly didn't benefit them in the same way.
Right.
Yeah, or benefited large adults with a lot of space in between them, so that they didn't touch each other and catch fire. You know?
Ponderosa pine or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like it's and so we've been having this conversation in Europe for almost 40 years.
Yeah.
And it's it's about as old as I am. Anyway.
Yeah.
I'm not almost 40. Yeah, but it's been happening for a long time, and it's already had conservation implications.
Mm-hmm.
Like there are areas in Europe that are managed in this way. It's like, oh no, we want high densities of herbivores here because it creates this more diverse thing. Like, oh no, like there's markets for wild ponies and primitive cattle breeds.
Yeah,
it's substitutes for wild horses and oryx because they. And
is the oryx capable of coming back?
I would argue it's not extinct.
Yeah. Okay.
But like that's semantics.
Yeah.
Right. Like you could argue that genetically you could probably alter a cow to become more oryx-like because we have the oryx genome.
So basically, the cow is the oryx.
Yeah. But cows are just domestic oryx.
Yeah.
Like that's, and there are some that are much more oryx-like than others.
For sure.
Yeah, and so those are in widespread use, and because they have measurable effects, and because it's cheaper than management.
Totally. Yeah. It's so expensive to take a hectare and get a bunch of people in there and some. It's $10,000 a hectare. We just
I
don't
can
have enough
throw
money.
some cattle and ponies on there. I won't feed them because the point is that they're eating what they can survive off. People will come to look at them.
Yeah.
Because it's nice. It's because landscapes are nicer when there's animals in them, right?
Yeah.
It's like I heard it described once that a landscape without animals is like a painting without people.
I read a study in Denmark, and they looked at happiness as correlated with your total earnings and the number of animals you see every day. And the happiness curve that we always see with money is, you get to this much, and then if you have $1 billion, I give you another $1 billion, it doesn't
You're not
make
any
you much happier. But if I give you 5 more species of birds, there's no actual endpoint. So the more species you have, the happier you are. So if our goal is happiness, we need more species.
Yeah, no, it's like this. I say that as a nature guy. If I'm like out in the thing and I see a bird I've never seen before, but
oh yeah, me too.
Yeah, and like I've had such a good experience since I moved to Europe with that kind of thing.
Yeah,
and it's like so widespread.
It's a very biodiverse environment.
And it's not even just, hey, we're doing this explicitly because we're rewilding.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like, oh no, we just let a guy run his cattle here because then we don't have to cut the grass and then we get more lapwings or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's and like it should be so much more widespread, and we just never think about it.
We never think about it. Yeah, we as a Canadian, you think that the dark forest is the highest level.
We're so lazy with our nature. And it's because we think we already have it.
Yes.
It's like, oh, well, what do we have to do?
That was my shock moving to the Yukon. I'm moving up to the most pristine part of the world, and I was like, where are all the animals? Yeah, exactly.
Well, when you think about it, if you look at all the species of birds that are native to Alaska, Yukon, Northern British Columbia, whatever you call it, most of them do not like spruce forest.
No.
Why would they? There's no food. Food. Like you get the you know what likes spruce forest? Woodpeckers. You know what they love? You know what they like about spruce forest? Burned ones.
Yeah.
Cut ones.
Yeah.
Spruce beetle outbreaks.
Spruce beetle outbreaks.
Love it.
Yeah. Pretty much it's squirrels.
Yes.
And squirrels are
and they like white spruce.
Yeah. They're a little bit dull, right? You know, they eat.
You might get flying squirrels, I suppose, too. But like they
like.
But you know what? They like catkins. They like birch. Or they like.
There's squirrels in Europe too.
Yes.
Yeah. You don't need a
squirrels in New York. They're
they're everywhere.
They're everywhere.
So, like I'm a forestry background, and so part of what I've been thinking about is like when I was in forestry school, we were learning that we take all the trees down because that's the natural cycle, and when you look at, they're trying to do mimicking nature, so we look at a landscape, say, okay, here's a burn from 1960, wasn't put out, it burned 50,000 hectares, so our opening size can be as big as we want, and that's a natural thing, but probably that isn't the case if we go back to what all the creatures have evolved for, right? Like that's a new thing. This is the the Holocene. I hate to say the Anthropocene because apparently
honestly Holocene is equally stupid. We're in the Pleistocene from any geological perspective.
Yeah.
The only difference with Holocene and Anthropocene is how we define human impact.
Yes.
On that, which honestly you could say the point at which human impact became catastrophic to the environment is the point at which humans started existing.
Pretty much, yeah.
And it goes back farther than modern humans too. Like, there's a weird pattern you can see where, hominins evolve in Africa. Ooh, all the giant tortoises go extinct there. Oh, they've moved to South Asia. Oh, all the giant tortoises went extinct there. And it just keeps this happening because like North America still had giant tortoises when people showed up there. Same thing with, Australia had its own version of that, but it was not
megafauna in Australia, and it all disappeared within 1,000 years.
Yeah. 30,000 years before
and
the Younger Dryas.
Small. It's not.
No, that's not the point.
Yeah.
The point. That's a thing that comes up all the time. It's like the point isn't that I'm pointing fingers, right? First of all, we all did it.
Yeah.
It wasn't like one specific group.
No, it wasn't you.
It
wasn't me.
It was us, and it was people thousands of years ago. Who were just trying to feed themselves. But who
they had hungry kids.
Were part of a pattern that they couldn't see.
No, and we didn't have the knowledge, but now we have the knowledge that what we're missing, and I feel like we need to apply the knowledge of what we're missing. We also have the knowledge how to bring it back somewhat, but don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
No, and like our ability to actually bring things back is not great.
Maybe like that's where the species argument at the beginning of this conversation was.
Sure.
If you have a horse in the system and you had a horse in the system before, a horse is
a horse, of course.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
And we shouldn't call it invasive.
Yeah, if we make an elephant with some mammoth genes that can perform the same function as a mammoth, that's good enough for me. You know, like the point isn't that we're trying to return to some mythical thing. And like obviously the conversation can go very differently the farther you get from things like there's a whole argument happening in Australia right now.
Yeah.
About like when you get down to it, it might be better to have the wrong megafauna than no megafauna. You know, if we're talking about water buffalo and dromedary camels, it's maybe those things aren't all that similar to the things that you had, but but also the bigger you get,
the less it matters.
The bigger you get.
Let's talk about camels for a second.
Yes.
In the Yukon.
Oh yeah, camels. So I was going to mention that earlier. Or another thing you would run into especially in interglacials, because it's unclear to what degree camels were present on the mammoth steppe. They certainly crossed Beringia at some point, but it would have been a long time ago. Possibly before I got back to it. But definitely during interglacials, there were camels in Alaska, Yukon, on the grasslands that existed there. Which, honestly, even their very existence there, it implies that it was not all forest.
Right.
It couldn't have been.
No.
Like you know what camels eat? Not conifers.
Yeah, they eat grass.
Well, and actually, they could be characterized as browsers, but open country browsers. You know, they're eating. They would probably have been eating willow and Saskatoon and all that kind of stuff. And probably eating a lot of it.
Dogwood.
Because camels were all over North America, and when
did they evolved in South America?
No, also North America.
Okay, so the camel and the horse are both things.
So they left North America earlier. Because camels that survive today descend from a genus called Paracamelus, which evolved in North America a long time ago. And later left. So it's been a while. And also the ancestors of the llamas also evolved in North America and then moved south. But then they both went extinct there. But they were part of a niche that is often forgotten, which is open country browser. They were living in herds. They were in open habitats, but they were mostly eating poor quality, very spiny, often plants
like rose bushes.
Exactly. Like when
a bit like a mountain goat today, maybe.
Sure, but imagine if goats weren't limited to alpine habitats. And were
that's just larger. Predator control, right?
Essentially, you can't have wild goats don't naturally live, or sheep don't naturally live in lowland kind of habitats because their entire predator avoidance strategy is dependent on
some steep ground.
Rough topography. But camels were everywhere. And very interesting story. During this, just prior to the Civil War, after the Mexican-American War, when the U.S. suddenly had access to the U.S. Southwest, they couldn't cross it with horses, and they hadn't built a train yet.
I've heard about this.
So they imported camels, which did the job great until the
Yeah.
project was kind of lost funding because of the Civil War.
Right.
But but
They escaped.
some did, but
Yeah.
there's never been like a big feral population or
Right.
anything. I don't think there's any left
Okay.
from that population. But they when they were there with the project, they were eating the things that they were eating was very interesting. They were eating saltbush, creosote,
Right.
Oak.
Stuff that you wouldn't ever expect to
In
eat.
fact, yeah.
Once again, the carrying capacity idea just thrown out the window.
Yeah, exactly. And that discussion was part of one of my favorite quotes about range management ever by Paul S. Martin, who was kind of the guy who popularized the overkill stuff. He said, "It's not undergrazed. Sorry, it's not overgrazed. It's underbrowsed."
Yes.
Because and that's a huge problem.
Yes,
Because even in rangelands with no conifers. Because if you have, say, and like that's a big thing behind like cattle and horses. And all of the problems with large amounts of those on rangeland ecosystems is like everybody's saying they're overgrazing.
Well, they're increasers and decreasing plants, and they eat all the good plants, and then they left the thistles. But you need some to eat the thistles.
That's part of the problem is that if you only have grazers in the system, they remove all of the grasses, and that actually creates less competition for all the shrubs. And so that's
become an increasing plant
and become a huge fire risk as well. So that because they generally
so there's no such thing as overgrazed, just underbrowsed.
Exactly.
And
like the problem isn't even necessarily that there's too many grazers in the system. The problem is that there's nothing to counteract this competitive advantage that's being given to shrubs.
Because we had in North America, particularly 55 species of megafauna that went extinct.
Hugely variable. You would have sloths everywhere.
The niches are
camels everywhere, elephants everywhere. They're just hammering this stuff.
Plants didn't stand a chance.
Like honestly, I challenge any rangeland ecologist from America to go to a megafaunal system in Africa and see whether or not they would normally judge it as undergrazed or overgrazed.
Like
kind of switch my
10,000 wildebeest coming across the land.
This is overgrazed.
I just feel like that's my take on it. Like when you get it going, it takes off, and then when you stop interfering, especially in Western Canada, the trees just come in and take it over.
Because feedback loops go both ways. Yes, if you put more herbivores into the system, it increases carrying capacity. But if you're constantly taking them out, it's also constantly worsening habitat. You get in these.
I love sheep. I just mountain sheep, Dall sheep, and Grant showed me it would have been a ram that would have died. So it's the horn. And it was 6 years old, and it was big, full curl 6-year-old. And I've never seen a big curl 6-year-old. Maybe sometimes, but very, very unusual. And he was saying they looked at the genetics of the sheep population in this time frame when there was more animals around. And it might have been 10 to 15 times higher than it is today. If you look at the mountain sheep as an iconic species, and you look at the mountains where all these grasses, there actually isn't that many mountain sheep where all these grasses are, probably because they're limited to these very small pockets of specific things, whereas if there was more creatures up there pushing the brush back.
There's so many like rare forbs and herbs and stuff that you only find on like slopes and other weird conditions. And there's in and around Whitehorse, there's also a lot of like relictual populations of grasses that we otherwise associate with prairies.
Cooswa Lake has some grasses that are only found in Lake Baikal, is that correct?
Yeah, something like that. I don't remember all the specifics, but there's a lot of examples.
They're like holdover populations, but the hopeful part for me is that we do have what we need to move this system back towards, even if we could get it to 10% of what it used to be, that might be 5 times higher.
Climate change might even be pushing us more towards that direction. Like not only because of the fire cycle shortening, which is actually putting birch and aspen at an advantage in a lot of places. But also because things are generally getting drier in the West, which is also going to be to the benefit of grasslands. And I think
But when we say that, I've read some articles and it was a bit like, well, we're gonna lose all the spruce in Canada. I'm like, well, it's 56% of our
we're not going to lose all of it.
It's a lot of spruce to lose. It's not a very diverse system when over half of the forests in Canada are black spruce.
No, and like honestly, spruce being so common is part of the problem.
Yeah.
Right? Like it actively prevents us using the land for something else.
Yeah.
I mean, like you were just saying, if there used to be 10, 15 times more doll sheep, if there was again, that's an industry.
Not only is it an industry, but the biodiversity associated with the nutrient turnover, and you're building the carbon on the soils on the mountains, and the little bit of water you are getting is getting preserved in the soil, so you can grow even more plants versus just sort of, turn it into desert. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. It's people talk about the Buffalo Commons. Like the Buffalo Commons could be Whitehorse.
Yeah,
like it could be Fairbanks.
Or it could be Whitehorse to Fairbanks.
Yeah,
it's happening.
It could be the entirety of the interior. Yeah.
Yeah, we just had a referendum in the Yukon. They wanted, not a referendum, but they were looking for feedback. So the management plan was to get that herd to 1,200, and it's potentially it's as high as 2,200 right now. And they're basically saying, is everybody okay with it? There's 2,200 bison instead of 1,200 bison. I was like, that's good.
Let's do 22,000.
Yeah, why not?
Let's do 22 million.
Yeah, maybe not 22 million. Maybe.
Well, think about it. Millions is not maybe out of the question.
So I've read that this is more of a prairies question, but there's between 40 and 60 million bison when they kind of came across with the railroad. Yes. But that might have been an overestimation based on the fact that smallpox had eliminated a large percentage.
Yeah, it's kind of a controversial thing, but like there are historical records of European explorers going through that area long before Lewis and Clark.
Yep.
In like sort of the southern prairies of like Oklahoma or something like that, or and Kentucky.
Yep.
They saw 2 bison.
Yeah.
Which they called cows because that's what they knew to call them.
Yes.
And even Lewis and Clark described later that they really mostly saw bison and elk in places that were under tribal conflict,
right?
Places where nobody was going.
The borders of defined areas.
And then later, when that conflict was resolved, there weren't game in that area.
Right, because it was safe to hunt again.
Exactly. It's human pressure. We have this tendency to accept human pressure as a omnipresent thing in some places and not in others. It's like when you think about it, European bison were down to a very small number.
Yeah.
With the advent because hunting and agriculture was everywhere.
Yeah.
Wild boar went extinct multiple places.
Yeah.
The population in North America before the arrival of Europeans was not that different from that of Europe.
Yeah.
And it would have had to feed a huge number of people.
Yeah.
Who were agricultural, civilized.
To some extent, yeah, they're growing corn.
Yeah, they were people who had like a
fairly advanced civilization.
Yes, a high requirement society, just like any other.
Yeah.
And when that collapsed, it would have taken a huge amount of land and out of production.
Right.
Led to a huge amount of plants taking over, which would have taken a huge amount of CO2 out of the atmosphere and may have caused a little ice age.
Is that right, eh?
Yeah.
Okay, so the smallpox in North America is potentially
it's estimated, well, that and other diseases in combination are and probably over a protracted period between like 1600.
I wonder why bison priscus disappears in the Yukon 400 years ago. I wonder if it has something to do with like a brucellus or some kind of tuberculosis.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, it's a weird timing.
Yeah.
Like elk and bison both seem to have disappeared from Alaska, Yukon just before Europeans.
Yeah, yeah.
And the one possibility I've thought about is that while it predates the arrival of Europeans physically.
Yeah.
It doesn't predate the arrival of diseases,
livestock,
or of trading with the Russians.
Yeah.
For things like rifles.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true too, eh? Yeah. I never thought of that.
Yeah. So the answer is I don't know.
Yeah. But nobody does.
But there was a lot going on, and it's also possible that if there was suddenly a huge reduction in the native population, that would have led to a breakdown in fire management, which might have been what was keeping bison and elk on life support. Otherwise, it's just conifers moving.
exactly, the invasive spruce.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have an anti-spruce bias, so.
Yeah, no, I get it.
It's great for firewood, but.
Yeah, I mean, it was the same thing with being anti-beach in a lot of Europe. You know,
Yeah.
it's like
They've learned their lesson now, so.
yeah,
Yeah.
some places.
I think a lot of the Germans were pretty disappointed with their beautiful spruce forests when they all got killed by the bark beetle in the last 10 years. And we should probably have a little more oak and beech on the landscape.
Yeah, we should probably diversify. It's like anything, right?
Yeah.
It's like any investment. You diversify.
Yeah.
Why have one thing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The forest shouldn't be one species.
Yeah. Why are we just doing softwoods? Why are we?
Yeah.
You know, why aren't we also managing this for game? Why aren't we doing hardwoods? Why?
And the more, like I find with the landscape, the more things you do with it, the more things it'll do.
Yes.
Right. So
Yeah.
if it's just a big canola field, it's not very diverse, is it?
No.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad we can do this.
Something of there's a book that I just read. Like I don't read fiction, and I'm always a little bit nervous about reading history. But when you read a diary, then the tendency is to be certainly more representative of what went on that day.
Mm.
And I just read a book called Where the River Runs, which is about Saskatchewan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
It's a great book, and when it's talking about the bison herds, like the first Hudson Bay people, which were the first Europeans in Saskatchewan, and it's talking about the bison herds.
Yeah.
They were freaking huge.
Yeah.
Like that was 1700s.
Oh yeah.
And
But that's like that's a long time, right? Because like if you think about it, if there were several thousand bison when the human collapse happened, give that 200 years.
Yeah.
You can go from a few thousand bison to many millions of bison at just 5% increase per year.
Yeah.
And that's seems to have been what happened.
Yeah. So like the smallpox went ahead.
No, the smallpox came with the Europeans, but not with the early Europeans.
Okay.
It came with the settlers.
Right.
Yeah, it came in a lot of different rates, and it was also different diseases too.
It
There
could
was
have been
also
more than small.
cholera, dysentery,
Yeah.
tuberculosis.
So that came with agriculture,
Right.
not with fur traders.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things that seem to move faster than Europeans themselves. Horses were also traded to the interior much faster
Yeah.
than
They had
Europeans
Russian
did.
coins far away from Russia.
Oh yeah, and rifles.
But it's actually that's a book that you might want to read.
Totally.
Too.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I've heard of it. Like I think.
Yeah.
Where
I
the
love
river-
diaries.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that kind of stuff. Too.
Samuel Black was the first person that ever went up the Finley River, so this is like northeastern BC.
Mhm.
Just got the 1954 copy at the Hudson's Bay Archives Society. That's kind of a rare book, but you go through there and they barely saw anything. Like they were living on marmots.
Yeah.
And this is the most wildernessy part of the world. Even today, it's an
think-
absolute wilderness.
A lot of the time when we read accounts from like the late 1700s or the 1800s, what is being described as post-apocalyptic.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, it's like it's a landscape where so many people have died.
Yeah.
And it's the fallout.
Yeah. Well, he was saying it's actually quite a few people still in that area.
Oh sure, but like
Yeah.
there
There was
has-
no food.
no.
Yeah.
Why would there not have been food in the mid 1800s?
It's 1824 he went up. He's quite optimistic about his guides, which are Seconese, and then there's some eastern tribes that sort of friends or whatever. But the local people have gone up. They didn't think much that there wasn't much food.
And to be fair, there's probably a lot of areas where there never was.
Yeah, I don't think
You
there
know,
was a lot
Yeah,
there.
like Eastern boreal forest is pretty.
Yeah.
It's almost less productive than the West. Well,
Northwest Territories has 40,000 people in it today, and it's 2
Yeah.
million square kilometers.
yeah, and the East is so much wetter.
Mm-hmm.
That, like, if
Snow.
you look at sort of the climate space where you might expect steppe,
Yeah.
you do see a lot of Western boreal places fall sort of within that or on the periphery of that.
Yeah.
It's not true of like eastern boreal
Yeah.
cities. It's like
Quebec black spruce.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like because it's just so much wetter in the east.
I feel so. What do you? So on that note, if you had a mastodon sitting in that black spruce swamp that we call Ontario and Quebec, like they wouldn't have been bothered by the snow very much if they had that much food, right?
No.
Because predation isn't an issue.
Not for
because,
something that big, no.
Yeah, they elephants never really get preyed on, and especially, you know,
Same is true of hippos or rhinos.
yeah, they're immune from predation, and
Even large buffalo, it's pretty contextual. You know, it's like lions eat buffalo,
Yeah.
but
they also get killed by buffalo.
Yeah, do they control them? Not always. And buffalo are also often food.
And by buffalo, you're talking African.
Yeah, African buffalo.
Yeah.
But it is relevant when we think about bison, right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, were they controlled by predators? Probably depended.
Yeah,
Yeah.
The
man.
sick ones were.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I feel like there was a lot of plant eaters that didn't have a lot of meat eaters to chase them around, and now you have a few plant eaters, and they're quite concerned with the meat eaters. And there's very few meat eaters. Like how many wolves do you see in a year? You know, like a handful maybe.
Yeah.
You don't see 100 wolves in a day, right? You know.
Yeah, and an addendum to that herbivore density that we were talking to earlier
Yep.
is a carnivore density also much higher.
Must have been, yeah.
One wolf per square kilometer.
One wolf per square kilometer.
And half a lion.
One wolf per square kilometer. So BC would have had 1 million wolves instead of 8,000.
Yeah.
That's
Keep
your
in-
number.
that was based on estimates for like Siberia, Alaska. But so it might have been, it probably would have had to spread that out more if you had a greater diversity of carnivores.
Yeah. But regardless, if you look at your weight, like a black bear is a herbivore in my mind.
Oh, sure, you could, and honestly, most of the time, so is a brown bear.
Yeah.
And their densities are almost always higher than wolves.
way higher.
But that's another thing to consider too. Is like, well, what were the dynamics of bear populations like when there were big cats on the scene?
Right.
Because we know tigers hunt bears,
Right.
jaguars hunt bears,
Wolves
wolves
hunt
hunt Yeah, but like some cats preferentially hunt bears.
Okay.
Whereas like jaguars and tigers love bears
Hmm.
because it's like hunting a boar, right? It's a lot of fat, a lot of.
So if there was lots of wolves, what did they eat? Because there was no moose.
Well, there would have been some moose.
Antelope.
Yeah, they were probably eating a lot of sega antelope, a lot of
Reindeer.
caribou,
Yep.
a lot of regular elk,
Yep.
a lot of bison calves, horses. We actually know that isotopically, wolves were eating almost half their diet in Alaska, Yukon was horse.
But I guess it depends what period you're talking about.
Oh, absolutely.
This is
not-
pre-die-off.
In fact, the wolves that existed in Alaska, Yukon, in the late Pleistocene
Yeah.
are actually genetically and morphologically distinct from gray wolves that live
Today.
that live there today,
Yeah.
which seem to have come back up after the ice
So they
sheets.
came up from below
Yeah,
the
and
ice.
kind of replaced these sort of megafauna specialist wolves.
That was the one with the big jaw
Exactly,
that can chew a
So
bison.
they
up.
were eating horses and bison
Yeah.
calves and all these kind of things.
Yeah.
Whereas these sort of subglacial
Generalists.
wolves, which
Yeah.
were used to competing with a lot of carnivores,
Yeah.
and which were eating a lot of like moose calf and
Yeah.
the occasional caribou or
Yeah.
Dall sheep.
Yeah.
They came up because they were able to exploit what was still there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and live in much lower densities
Yeah.
as a result.
Yeah.
But generally it's. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see because even now wolves are kind of hesitant to hunt horses
Mhm.
because it's dangerous.
It's dangerous.
Like it's more dangerous than hunting a similarly sized elk.
A moose calf's a lot more fun.
Yeah, and moose
Yeah.
don't live in herds.
Marmots.
So if you attack a moose calf, you only have to deal with the mom.
Yeah, 12 wolves against mom and the
Yeah,
calf.
yeah. Meanwhile, if you attack a horse herd,
Yeah.
or even if
Yeah.
a foal, the stallion's going to kick your ass.
And the bisons, they just make a circle.
Yeah,
and
same
that's
thing
the
with
end of it.
muskox.
Yeah.
Even muskox you had in Dawson City till like 3,000 years ago.
And why do you think the muskox moved out of there?
It's an interesting thing that we see historically from native records.
Yeah.
But so muskox were found in northern Alaska until semi-recently.
Yeah.
Their disappearance from a lot of areas roughly coincides with the widespread adoption of sled dogs.
Okay.
Because
Right.
if you're living on the open tundra, the only way you can be hunted by people is if they can come get you.
Right.
And if it's worth it to bring the meat back.
Yeah.
If you're doing that on foot, no point.
Pretty hard to go that far.
And in fact, we're seeing a lot of muskox expand into boreal habitats now.
Okay.
Specifically in Whitehorse around the Slave Lakes area.
Yeah, Yellowknife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Yellowknife.
Yeah.
I got that mixed up.
Yeah. Not the first person to do that.
No, I always feel like one should be. Yeah, I don't know. But I don't know. But we're seeing a lot of muskox expand into the Whitehorse area.
Yeah.
No, Yellowknife area.
Yeah, along the lake.
Along the Slave Lakes. Yeah. In fact, their range is getting closer and closer every day to meeting the wood bison.
Is that right? Eh?
Yeah.
But they're very distinctive genetically.
Oh yeah. And it's not like they're going to breed or anything. In fact, muskox are more closely related to sheep than they are to cattle.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. In fact, the Latin name ovibos means sheepox.
Sheepbox. Gotcha.
But they were present in central Yukon until like 3,000 years ago. And my theory is that because all the boreal and southern species of muskox went extinct.
Okay.
Right.
So there was muskox.
Oh right, yeah. Sorry. So that's another thing that would have been a huge component of interglacial boreal.
Yeah.
Is Butherium, the wood ox.
Yeah.
Which was a relative of the muskox
Yeah.
that was a little longer-legged and probably less woolly.
Yeah.
That was living in boreal and temperate habitats.
Yeah.
It was essentially a southern muskox.
And this is a grazer or a both?
Probably a mixed feeder browser kind of thing, like a muskox is.
Yeah.
It's eating some of everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just by virtue of being medium-sized and not that biggie.
Right.
Muskox are the only ones that survived, the living ones, and I
Right.
think it's because they can survive on the open tundra,
Right.
and probably they were wiped out of a lot of other places where humans had higher
And
carrying
people weren't
capacity.
super excited about the open tundra until
No,
quite
but
recently.
you would have had at least some human population across most of the boreal region.
Yeah.
Especially following the second colonization of North America by people before Europeans.
Right.
Like the ancestors of the Inuit and the Dead Name.
Yeah, which was fairly recent, right?
Yeah.
So what is allowing the muskox to
I would say it's really
expand into the timbered lands now?
I think the hunting pressure is just much lower. Yeah.
Just because
Well,
the
it used to
hunters
be-
that used to be aren't hunting anymore?
Well, yeah, I mean, like you've gone from the system where everybody who lived anywhere was hunting all the time,
Yeah.
to one where there are hunters,
Yeah.
but it's not everybody,
Yeah,
it's not everywhere,
it's a tradition that's fading for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it's managed.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's limitations to how much you can take, right?
Yep.
So,
Exactly. So I think that's a big part of the difference is that muskox are moving into areas where hunting pressure used to be higher.
So the numbers overall are increasing for muskox, is that correct?
At least towards
Or just
the
moving?
periphery,
Or just moving?
just moving. I
Okay.
think.
So less on the open tundra and more into the forested lands?
Yeah, I think it's very. If I've looked into this a little bit, I think it's very variable. There are places where they're increasing and places where they're decreasing, and it doesn't seem to be entirely correlated with habitat.
right.
They seem
Like
to be,
everything.
are maybe increasing on the mainland and decreasing on islands.
Okay.
There seems to be maybe fewer of them in like Greenland and in.
Okay.
And in-
Greenland's population's healthy as far as I know.
Yeah, and part of it's
And that's all
and-
introduced, right?
The northern part isn't. The southwestern part is.
Okay. Yeah.
It's two separate
Right.
populations.
Gotcha.
A weird thing about muskox reintroductions is that they were all done before we realized that there were maybe 2 muskox subspecies.
Right.
So they were all introduced from Arctic islands.
Right.
So the population in Yukon and Alaska today is all from like Greenland
Right.
and
The Swedish big herd of what, there's
also
12
from
of them?
Greenland. Yeah. All the Siberian populations that have been introduced are like Greenland.
One went
But-
for a walk once in Sweden. It
Oh,
walked
yeah.
like 300 kilometers. And it was the news every day. There's a muskox here. And
Oh, yeah.
He was looking for a lover, I guess. I went
That's
back.
funny. It went back. But it's a weird pattern. But like there is sort of a mainland form that you still find in like in Nunavut
Right.
and parts of Northwest Territories,
Yeah.
and that's the one that's expanding into the boreal
Right.
region. But that form has been hunted out of Alaska, Yukon.
Right. So it's a good
Yeah,
opportunity for a reintroduction.
Especially if we're doing because all the reintroductions that have happened so far have been in the tundra zone.
Right.
So if you were going to try one in the
Yeah.
interior,
Yeah, that'd be a good place up in the
Yeah.
Dempster probably.
I'm part of a project that's kind of looking to do
Nice.
something like this near Fairbanks,
Cool.
north of Denali.
Yeah.
but not with, maybe with, not just with muskox, but with herbivores in general, just sort of experimenting, because there's also all of these implications for permafrost.
Yeah.
Right, it's like
pound the snow down and get that stuff cold, right?
exactly, yeah, exactly, because you know.
I gotta ask you one question. If I was, because Canadians love dark spruce forest, the argument I've heard from several researchers are that if you have a thick forest with a lot of moss, on a hot day, in the summertime, you're protecting the permafrost because there's shade and there's moss, and I'm like, yeah, but how do you get the cold air in? If the spruce is there,
insulation is bad if it's keeping the cold air out.
And the albedo of spruce, once again, I'm an anti-spruce person. It's such a hot species. It's so dark.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas if you replace all of that with grass or anything deciduous, and then remove all the snow with herbivory, like bison can excavate an entire area like 3 times a winter.
Yeah.
Or you can watch them do it.
I watched him do it last week.
Hey, and then that actually cools the earth because it allows the cold winter air to
get into the soil.
Yeah.
You can't have permafrost if you have 3 feet of snow.
No, it also potentially creates new permafrost because you're putting down new soil through trampling and dung.
Yeah. It's bad. Spruce is bad.
So a question, and I'm not sure how to phrase this, but in the big picture, if we're going to talk about climate change in general, is logging is managing the forest good for climate change or bad for climate change?
I don't think it's a binary answer. I think it would depend on what you're doing.
Depends how you manage it.
You know, like it's like
that's what I mean. Like if you're managing it, say Swedish style.
Oh, sure. Like I think
so.
Managing for biodiversity in many ways is also managing for carbon capture, especially in boreal habitats. Like there was this study they did that showed that because the fire cycle was being shortened in a lot of places and all that. Sorry. I was sick last week and my cough hasn't quite gone away.
It's all good.
Yeah, not contagious. But in Alaska, Yukon, there's been this sort of shortening of the fire cycle, which is actually making a lot of spruce die before they reach the
birch and aspen.
And leading to replacement by birch and
better
aspen.
albedo.
Yeah, that's part of it, but also because they're hardwood trees and they have to grow so much faster, the regrowth of birch and aspen is calculated to have removed more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than the fire put in.
Right. Okay.
And
so that's cool.
Yes. So hypothetically managing and
so excuse me just for a second.
Yes.
Is that because they're more efficient? Like this broadleaf is more efficient than a conifer?
Yes, and because they're denser. They hold more carbon in an individual plant, and because their wood is heavier, is heavier.
Particularly birch.
So they have to take a huge amount of carbon just to do that. The counter to that, however, is that birch and aspen also store much more of their carbon above ground.
Right.
Which makes it potentially more vulnerable if there was another fire.
Right. But they're less vulnerable to fire.
But they're also less vulnerable to fire in the first place.
Yeah.
But the counter to that is that birch and aspen are also far more edible.
Yes.
Meaning, if you then have something eating that, moose, bison, whatever, they can then take that carbon and put it directly into the soil where it can't be damaged at all.
Yes.
So I would say generally management is good for carbon.
Yeah.
But that obviously it's specific of how you do it.
So when you look at the life cycle though of deciduous trees,
yes,
what deciduous stands, when they become decadent, then they are losing a lot of carbon.
Yes,
they fall down and they deteriorate and they release their carbon, as I understand.
If they don't get it eaten, if they're not getting eaten, they're going to get big.
Yes,
they're going to die, fall over, and rot.
Yes, but of course conifers will do that.
Yeah.
So it's
conifer has a slower release.
But also, I think the another point to add to that is that I think in a system with a lot of herbivores, there'd probably be fewer adult aspen and birch trees because they're so edible. Yeah, I think probably the whole point is that you would move a lot more of that biomass into grass and willows and herbs and things that are going to also cycle much
Yeah.
faster and be trampled into the earth much
Yeah,
faster.
well, what we want to do is we want to put carbon into the soil because carbon holds water and lets plants grow faster, and it's safer in the soil than it is above, so even moss isn't very safe, it'll burn when it's dry.
Yeah, especially if the fires are getting hotter.
And biodiversity is the biggest contributor
Yes,
to
putting carbon in the soil.
putting carbon.
We need more
in the soil.
cows out there is what we need.
Gotcha.
Yeah, more cows, more bison, however you want to
Everything.
Yeah, bison are good because they also excavate snow much more efficiently.
Yeah, they pushed back the spruce a bit, I've watched them, I get proud
Yes,
of
like
them
there was just a study done on European bison that showed most of their debarking effects. The species that was hit hardest in Poland was Norway spruce, which is a very close relative of black spruce.
Yeah.
It was, and it wasn't because they were eating it. It's because if there's a big tree in the middle of a field, they'll just rub it until all the bark is gone.
Scratch.
Yeah,
That's what I see, they're itching
Yeah.
themselves.
They've got lodgepole pine in Yellowstone in the open areas down to almost zero regeneration and a complete death because the bison are just debarking all of them.
Yeah,
Just creating these big grasslands.
I
instead.
love them.
I saw a great picture the other day that was an exclosure experiment in Yellowstone. It's just this big field of grass and this little fence with some trees.
There's one on the Asiac Road, same thing, it's just a fence and you can see the bushes coming in and then around it, it's, well, I was at one of the where we found the bison there like 9 days ago, like, I was trying to estimate bison plops and I was over 1 per square meter.
Yeah.
You know, and they're staying there for a bit, like some of them might be
They're fairly
year old,
widespread.
but 1 per square meter, like, I don't know how long it takes, how many hours of a bison living on a landscape to make a poop. 2
Yeah, I don't know.
hours or 3 hours, but
Yeah.
it's a lot of 1 per square meter is a lot of time spent on a hectare because it's probably only going to stick around for 2 or 3 years. It's not going to be 10 years old, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Now, I think a lot of the limitations to us studying these kind of effects are density related, right? Like you see a far more impact when you just have a lot of animals, which makes sense.
Yeah.
But it is people don't really know how much a lot of animals is.
yes, that was the whole point of this whole conversation.
Yeah.
What you think you see as lots isn't.
No.
Compared to 40 million years.
Yeah.
Right. This is an
It's a
anomaly.
weird,
We need to get back to that.
post-apocalyptic.
This is 64.8 million years ago.
Yeah.
It's the same. There's actually I phoned in my quest for knowledge here. I phoned a coal geologist, and I was asking about coal formations. A lot of coal formations are from the Carboniferous.
Sure. Yeah.
350 million.
Yeah,
years
something
ago.
crazy, right?
There's almost no coal deposits after that, but there's a bunch of coal deposits in the 55 million year range. Forest world.
Exactly, forest world, because nothing was eating anything.
Yeah. Because there wasn't anything.
There were no dinosaurs and there were no big mammals. It was like rainforest forever.
Yeah, and humans, Harry, when the big comet came down from the sky and wiped everything out, we were about 37 grams, I think.
Oh yeah, I mean, like the
ancestor of humans.
The reason mammals survived the dinosaur extinction is because there were so many of us that could live underground, be small, be warm-blooded, and eat insects.
Small amounts of things.
Yeah, eat things that could survive on detritus, like slugs and things like that. Yeah. It's also why the birds survived.
Yeah.
But it's
I think the ancestor of elephants was about 100 kilograms. So
oh sure,
20
like
pounds.
most of the mammal diversity that.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the splits happened before the dinosaur extinction, but
Yeah.
still, we mostly looked the same until
until
this big diversification event happened.
It took 20 million years.
Yeah, because
I
for a
don't wanna
while,
think 20 million
mammals
years.
didn't really realize the dinosaurs were gone. It was it's like
Forest
now-
worlds are great, but it's nice to have food.
Yes,
Yeah.
and eventually we saw the emergence of something new that even the dinosaurs never witnessed. The grass worlds.
Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, cool. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, of course. I'm so glad.
Yeah. Is your wife here? Or?
Yes, she is. She's